The Imperial Guard Commissar is perhaps one of the most iconic and enduring images in all of Warhammer 40k. Yet somehow I've never made a video on them, so let us make haste to rectify that criminal oversight. The modern-day Imperial Guard Commissar, an officer of the Officio Prefectus, can trace their origins all the way back and beyond the Great Crusade. Due to the fact that we can find Commissars or Commissar equivalent positions within the ranks of many Imperial Army regiments raised during the Great Crusade, we can summarize that this is an idea that were brought to these planets preceding even the Crusade, preceding even the planet's colonization. In all due likelihood, the origin point of the modern-day Imperial Commissar can be found in a time not so far removed from our own. Obviously, the most popular image of the political officer is that of the Soviet Union's Commissars, which is in all due likelihood exactly where the 40k equivalent got both their appearance and name. Though the actual origins point of the idea of a political officer, somebody to be attached to an army with wide-ranging command authorities and even the ability to remove or otherwise chastise military officers in the field, is actually from the very late 1700s, during the French Revolution, where the Legislative Assembly and its eventual successor, the National Convention, would dispatch political officers to oversee the armies fighting under its command, making sure that these armies were not, in fact, compromised by royalist agents, and that they maintained the correct revolutionary zeal. These dispatched officials were initially referred to as, and I will butcher this, represent une mission, and a little bit later on as Commissari politique, or literally political commissioner. This idea of having a political officer has repeated itself a fair few times during later modern human history, amongst others, as mentioned, within the Soviet Union and within the so-called Republic of China as well, and various smaller Soviet-style or communist powers. And their idea is always the same. It is to ensure that the fighting men at the front line are up to a correct political standard, that they can be relied upon to continue the works of the revolution, and most importantly of all, their job is to make sure that no counter-revolutionary elements are allowed to set roots in the army. The role of the modern-day 41st Millennium Commissar is much the same: to ensure that the regiments of the Imperial Guard remain committed to the Imperial Creed and he who sits the Golden Throne. Though, their threats are somewhat more obvious, and yet also simultaneously far more subtle than those faced by the 21st century Commissars. For chaos is very much so a real force, and its ability to spread and infect the minds of men behaves in, well, much the same way that the revolutionaries believed that counter-revolutionary notions might spread too, as a disease. And whilst one may debate the merits and the necessity of commissars in our timeline, one would need to be very foolish indeed to dispute the necessity of the Officio Prefectus in the 41st millennium. The tempting whispers of dark gods are everywhere, as are the seductive lies of alien tyrants and miscreant mutants and rogue psychers. Only an ironed will and an even stronger sense of discipline can be counted on to counter this malaise. This was a fact already well known during the earliest days of humanity's exploration into the stars, as we see various political officer organizations pop up in the very early Imperial Army regiments. These were known as discipline masters, and their primary stated purpose was to ensure the immediate obedience of the troops under their command. In essence, these were less direct political commissars and more along the lines of disciplinarians. Although, again, the origins of their profession probably had something more to do with ideological commitment and purity rather than necessarily just the maintenance of discipline itself. We can see this in their dual purpose, as many of these discipline masters were usually also used to hunt down deserters and people that had otherwise broken ranks. This is also where we see some of the earliest instances of commissars having the authority to either remove officers from command or outright execute soldiers who fail in their duties. Now, the precise origins of the current-day Officio Prefectus is slightly muddled, as we both have the discipline masters, which would seem to be an obvious foundation for the Officio Prefectus, but we also have newer Horus Heresy law suggesting that the Officio itself was in fact initially formed as the Command Prefectus, which was an Imperial Fists initiative to create a group of disciplinarians to help during the Siege of Terra, to make sure that the Imperial Army elements that were fighting alongside the Imperial Fists and other garrison forces would be adequately motivated to hold their positions even in the face of everything the rogue War Master could throw at them. Another interpretation of the creation of the Prefectus was that they were in essence an ad hoc semi-inquisitorial organization formed immediately after the Horus Heresy, as the powers that be quickly realized that there were going to be a lot of traitors that needed cleaning up out there. A whole host of traitor Imperial Army regiments, of renegades, of heretics, as the word began to carry very real meaning at that time. And it would also be difficult to determine exactly where the rot started, when it began, where it ended, and with whom ultimate responsibility lay. Running every such case of a planetary governor going rogue, every officer going rogue, every Imperial Guardsman electing to follow along with his regiment's decisions, etc., through the court systems would be an exhausting, impossible, and absurdly bureaucratically demanding task. It would therefore be far easier to appoint a series of individuals with extended emergency powers to render judgment then and there upon the members of the military and the civilian populace alike. As, however, the Inquisition was eventually formed, it would obviously take over these duties. And, thereafter, seeing still the need to keep a close eye on the Imperial Army, now becoming the Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard, the Officio Prefectus was formed to create a direct oversight of the Guard by placing highly zealous and dedicated individuals outside of the regimental's normal command structure within those regiments. Additionally, the commissars, of course, would come from very different backgrounds, very different worlds, a very different culture overall than the regiment they would be attached to. This as well was not a mistake. The commissar is supposed to be an outsider. His connection to the regiment is intended to be tenuous, so that he may carry out immediate, swift, and potentially lethal judgment upon its members, be they rank-and-file soldiers or even the regiment's commanding officer. Personally, I prefer the latter interpretation, that the Officio Prefectus was created as an expedient organization, dealing with an immediate and obvious need, and then became a permanent organization after it became clear that this was actually a rather good idea, as not only, of course, can they function as inspirational beacons to the men, as the Commissars are universally brave and fine fighters to boot, able, willing, and expected to lead the charge when required, as bear you in mind here, Imperial Commissars are not solely a weapon of chastisement and punishment. They are equally so intended to lead the men, to inspire by their presence and example, as they are expected to lead and inspire via fear as well. Now, all of this would of course require very special instruction. First and foremost, the Commissars could not be raised alongside the regiments themselves so as to ensure they wouldn't grow overly attached to the men they needed to lead and, if required to, purge. They needed an external organization. Furthermore, this organization needed to be able to raise zealous and dedicated individuals capable of operating at the highest level, not just in terms of spiritual purity and determination, but also in close quarters combat abilities, the ability to lead men of any number, be it a squad, a platoon, a company, or even a regiment. And they must also be beyond all moral scrutiny. The Commissar has to be the best of the best, the purest of the pure, the most determined of the resolute, because if he is not, he may abuse his powers. And as those powers include the ability and authority to behead a regimental officer, that has to be avoided at all costs. Furthermore, the integrity and devotion of the Commissar must be beyond all question, all reproach. Otherwise, the moment he tries to execute an officer, he will have every guard in the room pointing his weapons at the Commissar. The Commissar must be an avatar, a beacon of purity and proper behavior, lest the men under his command view him as a threat rather than as a rallying beacon. Because, make no mistake here, the Imperial Commissar, although his job is most assuredly so to be feared, he can only be feared effectively if he's able to do his job outside of the command structure and outside of the immediate threat of simply being shot by the men he is commanding. He can only do this if they respect and fear him more than they fear the potential death at his hands. Forging such individuals is difficult indeed, and so the Commissars would be drawn from the ranks of the Schola Progenium, the elite school staffed only by the best and the brightest, from the Adeptus Ministorum, the Administratum, the Imperial Guard, the Abites, the Navy, you name it. There are none better suited to raising fresh generations of Imperial servants. And these Imperial servants will also come from the ranks of those branches, as the people enrolled within the Schola Progenium, the pupils, come from the children that have been bereft of parents due to the many wars and catastrophes that often curse the Imperium. Now, the Scholar does not just take any old orphan either. The children that are enrolled in the Schola Progenium are those of people worthy of extra note and honor. They are nobles, officers of some repute or achievement. Those who have committed great deeds in the service of the Imperium, and whose lineage seem too pure, too good to allow to be extinguished or to simply waste away in some orphanage somewhere. In the halls of the Scholar, they will receive tutelage in matters of tactics, doctrine, philosophy, religion, combat, and anything else they require. Upon the completion of their training at the Schola, the young and eager pupils are dispatched to the many specialized branches of the Imperium, the Schola providing recruits to the Adeptus Arbites, the Administratum, the Ministorum, the Adeptus Horaritas, even on occasion the Inquisition, and of course, the Commissariat. Upon being selected to the prestigious ranks of the Officio Prefectus, the young Commissar will then be given additional training: how to lead men, how to inspire men, when and how to instill fear, when to inspire, when to be a harsh disciplinarian, and when to bend just a little. When the young Commissar finishes this second round of training, he is then dispatched for a final round of tutelage in the field. As the kind of bravery, judgment, and resolute action that is required of a Commissar can hardly be taught in a classroom. During this final period of his education, the Commissar is seconded to a fully fledged veteran Commissar, embedded within one of the countless regiments of the Imperial Guard with the rank of Cadet Commissar. He still has significant powers and authorities, but his actions are directed by the veteran Commissar, whose responsibility it is to train and teach the young Commissar on how to behave and how to act, or indeed how not to act when required. As a truly good Commissar has many tools with which to inspire obedience, and this is, of course, where things get somewhat complicated. I'm sure many of you have read the excellent first and only novels about Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt and the Tarnith First and Only. Ibrahim Gaunt is presented as a rather rare kind of Commissar, one that does not like to rule through fear. He prefers to lead by example, to inspire his men, and very rarely resorts to corporal punishment, and even rarer still, resorts to using the ultimate tool of a Commissar: field executions. And indeed, on the one occasion where he does carry out that ultimate censor during the siege of Vervunhive, it turns out to have been an enormous mistake, and an action caused more by a brief moment of irrationality on behalf of the Commissar due to a stressful and dangerous situation rather than his usual cool demeanor, as this action causes Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt a tremendous amount of consternation later on, and places him and the entire battlefield, in fact, in dire danger. But unfortunately, Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt is in all due likelihood a very rare creature indeed. First and foremost due to his double rank, as Commissars necessarily must exist outside of the regular command system. Therefore, a dual rank where he holds a commission within the Imperial Guard, that of Colonel, along with his rank as Commissar in the Officio Prefectus, well, it largely defeats the entire purpose of the Colonel Commissar, and it's a terrible idea. First and foremost, the role, of course, of an officer is to lead, and the role of a colonel is to lead the entire regiment. He's literally the brains behind the operation, and for him to grab a sword and a pistol and wander off to the front lines is the height of folly, as one bullet, and suddenly the entire Tarnith First and Only is leaderless and disorganized, not to mention demoralized. In fact, it was precisely such a set of circumstances that almost led to the complete annihilation of the Tarnith First and Only upon the world of Jago, when they were ordered to hold a fortified position known as Hensa House against a major chaos offensive. The Colonel Commissar was dragged out of the fortified positions and presumed lost and dead. The ghosts suffered gravely from this, and damn near met their end at the hands of the Chaos Forces during that engagement. Furthermore, the colonel of a regiment must be its absolute most trusted individual. It is at his instructions and orders that the ghosts go to battle. It is his orders they must follow absolutely and without question. Something that is all going to be made infinitely more difficult if he is also a source of fear within the regiment. Somebody that would be, in all due likelihood, deeply resented by many within the regiment. Again, of course, the Colonel Commissar is a rather unique beast in this respect, as he managed to be purely respected rather than also feared. And then, of course, there's the problem of, well, if the Commissar is there to keep an eye on the regiment's officer, what if the Commissar is also the officer? Yes. There's a very good reason why the dual command structure is very, 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 very rarely utilized, and was probably only actually implemented in the books because, well, it sounded really cool to have a commissar. And since you also need to have action and command authority be granted to somebody in such a novel, well, might as well give it to the commissar, I guess. But before we get too lost in the weeds, the first and foremost duty of a commissar will be to inspire the men. The whole field execution and fear thing is supposed to be a tool to be used to further this goal, to maintain discipline, and to ensure that the brave soldiers of the Imperial Guard are able to stand their ground against the countless, unimaginable horrors that the galaxy will throw at them again and again and again. And on many an occasion, the best way to ensure that is to put something even scarier and even more directly dangerous behind the men. This is the reason for their fanciful uniforms, their peaked caps, and usually the fact that they use some form of melee weapon. It is all to ensure that the commissar stands out like a living banner, as a person that men will obey without question and will easily be able to recognize on the battlefield. Their signature long leather greatcoats and relatively colorful uniforms. Now, the melee weapon is often and usually up to the preferences of the commissar in question. Obviously, cadet commissars will not be given quite this luxury, but established commissars can use a wide variety of preferred weaponry. They are not bound by any of the usual rules and regulations of the Imperial Guard fighting men. Most will choose something noble and honorable to inspire the soldiers around them, like a sword. A chain sword is the most common, although some, who are lucky enough, might use a power sword. Others may use a symbol or some sign of what their preferences are. Some commissars, for example, use a power maul or adopt a weapon that might evoke certain emotions from their soldiers. For example, if they are embedded within a very patricial regiment full of nobles coming from an honorable world used to be led by their betters, the commissar might adapt a rapier or some local weapon. Other planets that might be of significantly lower moral fiber, or indeed penal regiments, the commissar may elect to use something like a truncheon or a power maul, or some other thing that signifies authority and consequences to the poor people under his command. Certain other commissars have also been known to utilize, less subtle icons, like, for example, bringing a whip into battle. Which, not only is that not a very worthwhile weapon, though I'm sure with the technologies of the 41st millennium, you could probably produce a rather lethal whip, shrouded in an energy field, or perhaps having some sort of motorized chain running through it, or any other myriad of ways to make it absolutely horrifically lethal, both to the enemy and, more than likely so, the wielder as well. But still, a whip is not usually the ideal weapon for most battlefield circumstances. It does, however, quite clearly communicate intent to the soldiers. Yet other commissars have been known to do even more shocking and effective things. The extremely famous and successful Commissar Yarrick, for example, is perhaps most well known for defeating an orc boss during the siege of a hive on Armageddon. However, not before the orc boss in question had managed to tear one of Yarrick's arms off. Yarrick had calmly and collectedly then sliced the war boss's head off in return, bent down, and cut his arm off as well, raising the severed orc limb and its attached power claw high in the air and proclaiming his victory to the orcish hordes. This established his reputation amongst the orcs, and to make sure that they would not forget him, he decided to have the orc power claw grafted onto his own body, as an eternal reminder to the greenskins of what he had done. Now there's an iconic weapon, and no mistake about it. In terms of ranged weaponry, the Commissars usually utilize something small and light, a pistol of varying types. Those who are lucky enough to get a hold of them might prefer plasma weapons. Most others might have to do with a simple lasgun or other standard issue small arms, perhaps a slug thrower, or even bolt pistols. Now, I imagine that the bolt pistol is chosen more for its sound rather than necessarily its effect, more for its morale benefits, as the boom of a bolt pistol is going to have a nice rallying effect on the troops around you. Not to mention, there goes the badass Commissar with his enormous pistol, and the fact that I imagine most troops would not want to get shot with that thing, obviously. As, well, as we were talking about the effect of the weapon, sure, you will blow to absolute pieces pretty much anything short of an actual space marine you shoot with that thing, but, the recoil? Oh, mama. Not to mention the size and weight of the ammunition. You're probably only going to be carrying, 3-4 magazines for that thing? And each of those magazines is likely to only hold maybe 5-10 rounds if you're extraordinarily lucky. That's not a lot of rounds to bring into a firefight. But if your primary use of your sidearm is to restore the flagging morale of nearby troops, then that's probably all you need. More realistic Commissars will probably bring along a sidearm as precisely a backup weapon, using it to rally the men and look heroic, and then grabbing a lasgun or some other form of more effective ranged weapon when it comes time to actually fight something. Though in reality, a Commissar's most effective weapon, and the one that he should spend by far the most time honing, is neither his sword nor his gun, but his voice. A Commissar's ability to turn a good phrase, to belt out an inspirational speech, to motivate the men with tales of glory, of heroism, and honor yet to be won, that is his greatest strength, to keep the men around him fighting. Because at the end of the day, one more pistol, one more lasgun isn't really going to make the difference when your 10-man squad is being charged by 100 hormagaunts. A stern admonishment and an inspirational quote that'll keep those other 10 guns firing on full auto, however, that might just do it. And so all Commissars are given extensive oratory lessons, and during their period as cadet Commissars, this is probably one of the most important things that the mentor Commissar can possibly teach his young cadet. Though many Commissars will probably have very different opinions on what a Commissar cadet should be taught. Now, the spicy thing. Leadership. As mentioned already, Commissars do have the authority to execute virtually any member of the Astra Militarum at will, in essence. A commissar may well be called upon to justify his actions, but by and large, they are allowed and able to simply execute anyone from simple cadet all the way up to Lord Militant. And with, in essence, absolutely no process at all. At any moment, a commissar can, technically, pull out his pistol and execute anyone from a fleeing private to a platoon commander, to a company commander, to a regiment commander, to a man in charge of entire armies. And upon so doing, the commissar will either point at the next guy in line and tell him to do better, or, if he deems it necessary, seize personal command over any Imperial Guard elements for however long he deems necessary, or until replacements arrive. Technically speaking, the commissar could simply keep executing the replacements too, but again, they're not inquisitors. There are other commissars around, and generally speaking, if a commissar is seen to act out of line, a council of his fellows will be summoned in order to judge him, as the commissars do have a pecking order within the Officio Prefectus. And of course, any Imperial Guard Commissar is superior to any local Commissars, as there are local commissariats. We have several examples of various planets, for example, Calixes or Vavunhive, that have their own commissariats, although these are not official Imperial Guard Commissars. They are not members of the Officio Prefectus. They are, in essence, local political officers, and are styled as commissars more as a local affection rather than any indication of their actual influence on imperial law or imperial militaries. And no, a local commissar cannot carry out the same kind of summary punishments against Imperial Guard formations. Not in any normal circumstance, anyways. Although there are also examples of Imperial Guard commissars being dispatched to watch over planetary defense forces, in which case they are not a local commissar, they are in fact an actual official Imperial Guard commissar. This is done either as a sign of respect, of honor, or as the exact opposite, as a sign of deep and unabiding mistrust, as commissars are not necessarily just dispatched to regiments who have proven themselves unworthy or unreliable. If the Imperium had it its way, there would be commissars in every single regiment out there, and even some of the most long-serving, honorable, and effective regiments in the Imperium have commissars assigned to them, as most officers view, in fact, a commissar as a blessing. Under normal circumstances, if a member of the regiment steps out of line, breaks the law, or commits some form of heinous action against his comrades, against the civilian populace, etc., then the regiment itself will have to punish that man. The officers themselves will have to punish them, and that may easily cause all sorts of resentment within the regiment. No matter how well-deserved a punishment might be, you're still probably not going to look at your officer quite the same way after he had your comrade decapitated for stealing a potato. But a commissar, well, a commissar is supposed to be outside of the regiment. He is supposed to be a figure of fear. He is supposed to be resented. He is intended to be a magnet for the discontent of the regiment's members who feel wronged or in some other way alienated or distanced from the regiment, to protect its officers from the inevitable consequences of harsh punishment when it is required. And, of course, the officers too do need to fear their commissars, but a commissar executing a ranking officer is extraordinarily rare. It will cause no end of headache, no end of paperwork, and in many cases can have severe consequences for the Commissar himself. Many regiments, for example, are led by the luminaries of local planets, minor nobles, for example, or high-ranking nobles in some circumstances. If a Commissar simply pulls out his gun and kills one of them, they do not have the power of an inquisitor. They do not have their protections or their immunities. A Commissar can and have been held accountable for their actions on a plurality of occasions. And this is to say nothing of the far more pressing immediate consequences of executing your commanding officer mid-fucking battle. Again, the primary purpose of a Commissar is to reinforce discipline, to reinforce morale, to make the regiment at large more effective than it would be without the Commissar. If he simply goes around killing commanders, that's going to have the exact opposite effect. And so an officer really needs to step in it in most occasions to actually receive summary field execution. Now, Commissars do not necessarily also have to just kill the offending officer. There are plenty other actions that a Commissar can take. He can have the officer arrested, for example. He can have him stripped of rank. He can have him demoted. He can have him simply set aside for a temporary period whilst the second-in-command or the Commissar himself takes over. The extreme punishment is to be used extraordinarily sparingly, at least by wise Commissars, but just like with Inquisitors, there are all kinds of Commissars. Some understand the subtle nature of their work and their true purpose, and do their absolute best to ensure that their presence is only felt when actually required, and otherwise sinking into the background to be a firming presence, the steel at the backbone of the regiment, rather than an eternal tormentor that the men hate, as there's another danger too. Sure, the Commissar may indeed execute Imperial Guardsmen if he so choose, but he also has to serve alongside those soldiers. And during the heat of a battle, who's to say whether the last blast who felled the Commissar came from the front or the back? And obviously there are those Commissars who rule through just sheer fear as well, who completely reject the idea that they're supposed to rouse the men, to lead them, to inspire them, and instead fully embrace their visage of fear as the machine gun at the back of the charging penal legion troops, as the person who is supposed to be the embodiment of every guardsman's worst nightmare, instead of a heartening figure. These Commissars tend to not live too long in the field, unless they are assigned to very special regiments, and there's another thing as well. A Commissar assigned to a nice, noble regiment is unlikely to have all that much work, honestly. They are going to be men of breeding, of stature, that will have been raised on ideals of honor and proper behavior. In fact, in many cases in these regiments, if somebody steps out of line, it won't be the Commissar who shoots them, it will be their own comrades. In other occasions, if assigned to, say, a penal legion, then a rather strict personality is probably required. If you arrive at a penal regiment where they'll only actually respect you after they've seen you put one bolt in one of their buddies' necks, then, well, you better get to shooting as soon as possible. And in yet other regiments, like, say, for example, the Death Corps of Krieg, well, on the one hand, you're not going to have any discipline problems. On the other hand, you are going to be expected, as a representative of the Emperor's ultimate authority, to grab your sword and charge the machine guns. just like everybody else is. And, well, inspiring Krieg Guardsmen to acts of greater valor or death-defying bravery? Oh, that's an achievement. That is an achievement, and no doubt about it. Yet other commissars will simply never quite grasp the nuances of their regiment, and there are occasions when commissars have been reassigned or attached to regiments that better fit their personalities. In an ideal world, of course, that would be the solution to mismatched personalities. And the Officio Prefectus does make some efforts to make this happen, but much like the Administratum, by and large, they are a just do your job and we don't care how hard it is sort of organization. The life of an Imperial Commissar is a hard one, a very difficult one, an infinitely challenging one, and one that expects a lot more from its participants than a quick trigger finger. It requires a steely determination, a nimble mind, and a multi-talented individual to truly excel at being a commissar. And hopefully, after having listened to this, you'll have a better appreciation of what an Imperial Guard commissar is and what their duties are, at least should they choose to uphold them in the manner originally intended. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.